In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. We're going to take kind of a big picture look and consider a number of factors beyond the ones that you may already be familiar with that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. In the United States, the narrative regarding the fall of the Soviet Union often takes on a sort of mythological tale in which U.S. President Ronald Reagan rolls up his shirt sleeves and almost single-handedly takes down the Soviet Union with his force of will and through American defense buildups. The purpose of this lecture is not to bash Reagan. I mean, heck, I voted for him in '84. But to move beyond this simplistic sort of hero worship mantra, in part that's fed by political aspirations of American political parties, but to look at the multiplicity of factors behind the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. It is true that Reagan took a strong stance against the Soviet Union. There's no doubt about that. But be aware that there was an element of luck involved. He happened to be pushing at a moment in time when the Soviet Union happened to be tottering. I mean, presidents from Truman to Eisenhower to JFK to Johnson to Nixon to Carter had been anti-Soviet to varying degrees. And as for the defense buildup under Reagan, this process actually started under the Carter administration after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79. In short, Reagan played an important role, and he should get some credit, especially for courageous moments like his famous "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall" speech. But there are many, many other factors beyond this forceful U.S. president that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's start with Leonid Brezhnev, whose 18-year term as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party was second in length only to that of Joseph Stalin. He led the coup against Khrushchev, his predecessor, and in political ideology, Brezhnev was considered to be a conservative and a neo-Stalinist. While Soviet influence did grow during his years in power, at least in international terms, he also presided over the stagnation of the Soviet economy and decline in many ways of the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev's rule experienced widespread government corruption and corruption throughout its industrial sectors. And this kind of systemic decay that occurred during Brezhnev's rule means that he should bear some of the responsibility for the eventual downfall of the Soviet Union less than a decade after his death. Détente is a French word that it translates roughly as relaxation. Specifically for our purposes, it refers to a period in the 1970s when the United States sought to reduce tensions with the Soviets. The image on this slide is from 1974 with Brezhnev and Richard Nixon meeting in the Soviet Union to discuss arms limitation agreements. Several arms reduction treaties were negotiated during this period, and there was some normalization of relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. However, in the long run, détente proved to be a problem for the Soviet Union. Hardliners in the USSR despised what they saw as weakness toward the West, while the lifting of trade embargoes meant that the Soviet Union could buy grain from the United States during a period in the mid-'70s when it failed to produce enough grain to feed its citizens. While this was not widely publicized in the Soviet Union, this was viewed as an embarrassment to many Soviet officials and, in some ways, almost a condemnation of the system. The Catholic Church in Poland had long been a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. Unlike some Eastern European satellite states, Poland never engaged in efforts to de-Christianize or to disrupt Christian faith traditions in a meaningful way after it adopted a communist government. The Polish people in general are devoutly Roman Catholic, and Catholicism also has some deep cultural connections for Poles. Given the long period of history in which the Russian Empire had ruled over the Poles, dating back to the 1770s and into the First World War, Poland was really under the thumb, so to speak, of the Russian Empire. It's not surprising they would resent Soviet efforts to clamp down on Catholicism should they try to do so. Karol Józef Wojtyła, who would become Pope John Paul II, rose through the church hierarchy to become a powerful archbishop. He was noted for staunch anti-communism. In particular, a trip by the new Pope John Paul II after his election as the Pope in 1979, visiting Poland, is widely seen as a milestone in the weakening of the Soviet bloc. And in a way, even the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in 1981 kind of served to bolster his role as an anti-communist icon. Many documentary sources indicate that the Bulgarian and Soviet intelligence services likely played some role in the assassination attempt. And throughout his time as Pope, at least until the fall of the Soviet Union, he was an important figure in the anti-communist efforts. The 9-year Soviet war in Afghanistan lasted from December of '79 to February of 1989. A major part of the Cold War, this conflict was fought between Soviet-backed Afghan troops along with Soviet regulars fighting insurgents known as the Mujahideen, most of whom had deep Islamic ties. This was also a multinational force of Mujahideen fighters coming from all over the Islamic world to fight what they saw as an attack on the Islamic world, more so than just the government trying to put down rebels. At the peak, the Soviets fielded over 100,000 troops at any one time to augment some 50,000 Afghan regular military forces. The Soviets, however, faced insurgent fighters numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and the United States provided billions of dollars in military aid to the insurgents. The war, which cost the lives of tens of thousands of Soviet troops, at least 15,000 in direct battle, and many others, many tens of thousands wounded, and many others with shortened lives due to injuries they had suffered in the war. It was also a very severe strain on the Soviet economy, and this contributed to weak Soviet economic performance in the 1980s. Solidarność was a Polish labor union that ignited one of the first successful internal popular revolts against the communist regime. The Solidarność movement was the first non-communist labor group in the Soviet sphere, and it was founded in 1980 by Lech Walesa, who's pictured here. The Polish government initially attempted to abolish the union and crush it after imposing martial law, but eventually the government was forced to negotiate with the union. And the success of the Solidarność movement represented a real threat to the hegemony of the Soviets. It also provided inspiration to other reformers who would come later. Over the course of a little more than 3 years, the Soviet Union went through 3 general secretaries of the Communist Party, or 3 main leaders. After the death of Leonid Brezhnev in 1982, the next 2 Soviet leaders died while in office. Both were older men in their 70s, although Yuri Andropov, I think, was 67 when he was first elected general secretary and was expected. He seemed to be in good health, but this lack of stability at the very top of the political machine led to increased instability throughout the Soviet system. In part to address the problem of older leaders dying off, the 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary by the Politburo in 1985. Gorbachev was the first Soviet leader, by the way, to have been born after the Bolshevik Revolution. Gorbachev's leadership is noted for efforts to reform the Communist Party and revive the Soviet economy, but, and this is important to note, he sought to strengthen the Soviet Union with very modest reforms. And at no point during his rule as General Secretary did he envision destroying the Soviet system. Now, Gorbachev afterwards has engaged in some legacy-enhancing propaganda of his own, trying to say at times all along he really wanted to bring freedom and democracy. But it's clear from the documents at the time that he was a reformer of the system, not a destroyer of the system. Glasnost is a Russian word that translates roughly as political openness. Initially, the policy was introduced by Gorbachev to reduce corruption in Soviet industrial operations, which were notorious for the siphoning off of wealth. However, the media and citizens seizing this opportunity became much more critical of government, and this was an unintended consequence of Glasnost. Again, this idea was widely misinterpreted by many Westerners at the time as an intentional effort to improve freedom of speech, but that was not the case. This was supposed to be a very modest reform and very focused on Soviet industry, not the government initially. The poster on this slide reads, "Be bold, comrade. Openness is our strength." Another of the major reforms of Gorbachev was known as Perestroika. These were economic reforms designed to improve the efficiency of Soviet industry. State firms could now make their own production decisions instead of bureaucrats in Moscow or regional bureaucrats making production decisions for consumer goods or for industrial output. Some private ownership of business was permitted, which again, if you think back to the Soviet system, the ending of free enterprise, this was a bold step. It even allowed limited foreign investment of capital. Unfortunately, the reforms didn't take for a couple of reasons, but the bottom line was there was not enough free market spark provided by these very modest reforms to revive the Soviet economy. So it kind of worked counterproductively in two ways. Hardliners resented perestroika, and they said, see, we told you so. Bringing in free market reforms doesn't work. We need to go back. We need to go back and do away with these. But at the same time, it let this genie out of the bottle again of free market capitalism. And once people are traveling down this sort of slippery slope in the Soviet Union, then they want more of what they had been doled out in small amounts with perestroika. The nuclear disaster at Soviet Chernobyl plant in the Belarus Republic, which occurred in April of 1986, is still considered the worst nuclear plant accident in history. I'm saying this after the Fukushima disaster of 2011. And I'm basing this on the number of deaths and the extent of the damage, but history could prove differently. It has been 12 months since that disaster, so I'm fairly confident that Chernobyl will still rank as number one, but history proves me wrong. Well, I'll have to update the video. Anyways, the Soviets first denied and then downplayed the severity of the disaster, which was in part due to flawed designs and in part due to human error after the partial meltdown began. What was comical almost at the time, or frighteningly comical, I was an adult, I was 20-something at the time, was that news services in the West had video of some of this, and you could see the plant smoldering. Some of this was provided by reconnaissance flights, and some of this I don't know how the news media got a hold of it, but it was clear that something was going on, and yet the official denial for several weeks that that there was anything happening was it was hard to reconcile those two things. Approximately 500,000 people were forced to relocate due to radioactive fallout. The death toll from the accident is very difficult to determine. The number of people who died immediately after the event, or immediately from the event, is only a few dozen. I think the official death toll reported by the Soviet government is 31. It's probably a little higher than that. But the early deaths due to radiation exposure, especially thyroid cancer, is definitely going to be in the thousands. I've seen some statistics that adolescent to childhood thyroid cancer within a radius of, say, 500 miles of the plant is 10-fold or 20-fold the normal rate of thyroid cancer. I mean, it's a pretty rare disease for children, and it's frighteningly high. Some estimates suggest as many as 100,000 people will end up living significantly shortened lives due to radiation-induced cancers. There are thousands of documented cases, very gruesome, of human and animal mutations related to the Chernobyl disaster. I will spare you the freak show images in this lecture, but be forewarned that if you search for these pictures, some of them are quite disturbing, and they are far more disconcerting than the monsters you would see in a typical Hollywood horror flick, so you have been warned. This image from the Chernobyl plant shows the extent of the damage to the main reactor hall and the turbine building. This map shows the areas affected by the radioactive fallout and the relative severity of radiation levels. The red and dark orange areas are the areas most significantly affected by the fallout. The so-called Chernobyl exclusion zone is an area surrounding the plant. It's about 1,000 square miles. Human beings are not supposed to travel or reside in there, but there are several hundred people known as the Samosely, Samosely, if my memory is correct, that illegally reside in the zone today. And of course, Hollywood has not missed a chance to make. There was a recent horror film about Chernobyl that has absolutely no basis in fact. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 were student-led popular demonstrations in Beijing in that spring of that year. These protests had extensive support from city residents. Additional smaller protests popped up in hundreds of cities in China that year, though the Beijing protest was the only one that received significant coverage by Western media agencies due to the Communist Party censorship. The fact that these protests went on for several months means that there were significant factional splits among the political leadership of the Communist Party of China, as no consensus could be reached on how to deal with the protests initially. Eventually, the protests were crushed by the military, which was ordered by hardliners in the Communist Party to enforce martial law. The death toll of the crackdown is of some dispute. Figures range from a few hundred to a few thousand dead protesters. There were many thousands more arrested and jailed as a result of the protests. It has been largely covered up in China. Interestingly, so you have the image here of the iconic person known as Tank Man. To this day, he remains unidentified. There are some theories as to who he might be. He temporarily brought a column of Chinese tanks to a halt during the crackdown. And while this is well known in the West, to many Chinese today, the incident is shrouded in mystery due to the government's mostly successful attempts to control information. I remember some years ago working as a tutor at the University of Toledo at the Writing Center, and I had a Chinese student. We were talking about Tiananmen Square. He knew something about it, but when I said the words Tank Man, and he looked at me with a sort of a blank look on his face, and I said, "Oh, come on, you got to know Tank Man." He said, I don't know this Tank Man. Who are you talking about?" So I went to Google Images and typed in Tank Man. Of course, it was the first thing that popped up, and he'd never seen this photo. So I found that very interesting. So we had a little, discussion about it, and he's curious. I mean, he kind of knew the outlines of the protest, but he had never seen this image, which fascinated me as someone in the West. This is like etched into my brain, being alive at the time. While the protesters in Beijing had little immediate success in changing their government, their activism seems to have been a catalyst in revolutions that began appearing all throughout the communist world. June 4th, a revolution began in Poland and brought down the government. There was one in Hungary in October. The Berlin Wall fell the 9th of November in 1989. And East and West Germany started that process of reuniting beginning that night. Bulgaria's government fell the next day, November 10th. November 20th, the government in Czechoslovakia fell. The picture on this slide is of demonstrators in Romania during their revolution in December of 1989. This was the last major communist nation in that year of revolution of 1989 to experience its revolt. Unlike most of the revolutions, though, which were somewhat on the peaceful side or relatively bloodless, the Romanian Revolution was quite bloody. Over 1,100 people died, and thousands more were wounded. Among the dead in Romania was Nicolae Ceausescu, the country's last communist leader. He's pictured here. After a brief military trial, Ceausescu and his wife Elena were killed by a military firing squad. You can see his body here, pretty gruesome, but given his regime's bloody reputation in the 1970s through the 1989 revolution, it should not be surprising that Ceausescu and his wife met such a violent death at the hands of their own people. Boris Yeltsin was a career Soviet official who gradually moved to embrace democratic reforms and the free market philosophies. In 1981, just to give you an idea of his communist credos, he was made a full member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which we commonly call the Politburo. Originally, Yeltsin was a backer of the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, but he later became one of Gorbachev's most formidable political rivals. In 1987, Yeltsin actually became the first member of the Politburo to resign and maintain his life, because during the Stalin era, certainly there was members of the Politburo who resigned but met very ugly fates. But he began reshaping his political image after his pseudo-retirement from the Communist Party. as something of an anti-establishment rebel, definitely as a populist. Initially, he didn't seem to be strongly pro-capitalist, but he moved in that direction. Again, politicians put a wet finger to the wind, and he could see, certainly by the end of the 80s, which way the wind was blowing. To paraphrase Bob Dylan, Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or RSFSR, in June 91. This was by far the largest and most important of the Soviet republics. I like to think of it as, if you can imagine Texas, New York, Florida, California, and maybe Ohio all rolled into one giant state with a highly powerful governor, you get an idea of the importance of Boris Yeltsin at this time. The Soviet vice president, prime minister, and defense minister were very angered by the increasingly decentralized Soviet Union, and in an almost comical or even farcical attempt at a coup d'etat, Mikhail Gorbachev was placed under house arrest while he was on vacation in the Crimea. Yeltsin, again the RSFSR president, was scheduled to be arrested, and the coup leaders believed they could sort of take out a couple of people and they'd be able to save the system. Thousands of citizens and military personnel gathered in Moscow to protect the Russian White House and to protect Yeltsin's office. Pictured in this video still is an iconic photo of Boris Yeltsin on top of a tank parked in front of the Russian White House. This is a building that housed the Supreme Soviet of Russia, so it'd be more like a legislative or a congressional building. During the standoff, many military leaders defected from backing the coup leaders. The military instead backed Yeltsin, and the coup leaders were arrested. Gorbachev was saved from the coup leaders, but his power was quickly dissipating. Yeltsin, who was becoming increasingly powerful, again of the most powerful of the Soviet republics, decided to ban the Communist Party in November 1991, and this was kind of the death knell for the Soviet Union. Without a Communist Party in the biggest of the republics, it was doomed. And to the credit of the remaining Soviet officials, including Gorbachev, they went rather peacefully and quietly, almost turning over the keys to Yeltsin to the country at the end of 1991. So let's go to a bit of a wrap-up here and talk about, in a summary form, the major causes for this fall of the Soviet Union. So the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, again, sort of backfired with a lot of unintended consequences. What started out as very modest reforms to sort of prop up the Soviet Union became tools by which the Soviet Union was slowly being torn apart. The economy is an important factor in this, both the stagnation of the Soviet economy, the stagnation of the industrial machine of the Soviet Union. We have to include also falling oil prices in the 1980s, because one of the few export commodities the Soviets had was oil. And oil prices fell by 60 to 80% in the 1980s. And this really was kind of a strangulation on the Soviet Union, because they had no foreign currency to speak of when they didn't have the oil money coming in. There were shortages of almost all consumer goods. Soviet citizens had to stand in long lines to buy even basic items like bread and clothing and rice. The rise of the Russian black market worked against the Soviet system, as people learned they could buy almost anything if they had enough money. This promoted, of course, greed and corruption, as people needed to cheat the system and cheat their neighbors to get ahead. The mishandling of the Chernobyl disaster and the attempt to cover up the disaster made many average Soviet citizens doubt their government in a very real way. It's one thing when the government lies to you about some obscure policy. It's quite another when the government is lying to you about your health. Soviet losses in Afghanistan further weakened support for the regime. The effects were similar to the disenchantment in the United States as a result of the Vietnam War. The revolutions in Eastern Europe and the satellite states demonstrated that the Soviets did not have the means to put down mass rebellions or the willingness. Ethnic minorities throughout the Soviet Union, remember this is a country with dozens of ethnic groups, demanded greater autonomy, and this weakened the system. We've talked about the widespread corruption in government and industry. Throw in mass communications, the rise of global TV networks, throw in globalization, the spread of free market ideas, and of course we have to give some kudos to Ronald Reagan, who happened to be in the right place at the right time and happened to be doing the right thing at the right time, which was pushing a tottering Soviet Union. Today, the Russian Federation is still struggling. 25% of Russians are below the poverty line. Unemployment stands officially at 7% right now, but underemployment is approaching 20%. The GDP in the Soviet era has only recently been matched by Russia. Life expectancy for Russians is down 4 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. The healthcare system is in shambles. There's widespread corruption, and it's really not truly a democracy over there. It's a oligarchy, because these corrupt, wealthy oligarchs really run the country. But good news, I guess, for the Russians, is that oil prices have jumped in this decade, and the spike in oil prices has fueled 9% economic growth each year since 2000. So as long as oil prices remain high, the Russians will benefit from that. But again, it's a difficult thing to be sort of overly dependent upon one commodity for your economic growth. That brings to a close our discussion of the decline and fall of the Soviet Union.